Hi, good morning, everybody. We're three members of the Heart Organisation, and this week, with 40 other doctors, we signed a letter urgently to the Medicines Health Regulatory Authority, urging them not to extend any COVID vaccine down to children within the emergency authorisation. And we thought it might be helpful for three of us who signed the letter to explain what made us write it and what has made us so concerned. So I'll just quickly introduce ourselves. I'm Ros Jones. I'm a retired consultant paediatrician.
And I'm Alan Mordue. I'm a retired consultant in public health medicine.
And I'm John Flack. I'm also retired and have spent my career in the pharmaceutical industry, half the time in research and half the time in development.
So perhaps if I just start from the point of view of a paediatrician, I think the thing that struck me right back at the beginning of the pandemic was the blessing that it was apparent that children have so little impact from COVID-19. It was obvious even from China, they'd had no deaths in under 10s. And when it came to Italy, again, you could see that the death really was in the elderly largely. And in fact, every country, the average age of death from COVID has been slightly higher than the average age of all-cause deaths. So this is not a disease that affects children, which isn't to say that there is no child who's died of it. There have been, in particular, children with profound life-limiting conditions. But those children can already be vaccinated under compassionate grounds within the current regulations. What we are talking about is not vaccinating children who do not need it. Certainly, as a paediatrician, when I'm sat down in front of a patient and thinking about prescribing, all drugs, all medicines, all vaccines will have some side effects. And you're always weighing up the balance of, is the symptoms of this disease, how severe are they? What are the side effects known from this drug I want to give? How does it balance out? And obviously you would never treat somebody with something whether the treatment would be potentially worse than the disease. And for COVID, we're in a situation where the disease for children is really very mild. Half the children will have no symptoms and others will have just a sniffle or a slight cough. And very, very few become severely ill. The Royal College of Paediatrics did studies through the first wave and had 600 children in total admitted to hospitals that they followed, and looked at, well, there was in that series, there was no death in an otherwise healthy child. A very small number got quite a serious complication, inflammatory syndrome, but again, they all made a good recovery, although some of them did go into intensive care. And so we have to take this seriously. And the other thing that people talk about is long COVID. And again, that's a significant problem in a lot of adults. Children, it can occur, but it seems to be milder, it seems to be less common, and it also seems to resolve more quickly. And interestingly, there was a study published very recently looking at controls who hadn't had COVID at any point during the year compared with children who had. And the number of symptoms of fatigue, headache, anxiety, etc., were very comparable in both groups, because a lot of the symptoms may be actually to do with lockdown, and which we know has had a huge impact on children's general health and well-being. So that's the background to how sick children are and are not. And then we come to the risks from the vaccine. And I think at the beginning, the vaccine was being, obviously launched. And if you were elderly and at significant risk of COVID, the fact that these vaccines have no long-term safety data, you may well think that the risk of the disease is going to be greater than a hypothetical risk from the vaccine. But as the age range has come down of the vaccination program, it's become apparent that there are significant side effects, and they seem to, if anything, be slightly greater the younger you are, because they're probably related to your immune response in some way. So people with a healthy immune system may have worse reactions. So when the first cases of these thrombotic strokes first were reported, I remember talking to a friend who's a hematologist, and she was saying, oh, well, we've only had 10 cases and we've had 10 million doses of vaccine. But when you actually started looking down to see who had these complications, they were often much younger adults. And as there's been more awareness of this, there's been much more reporting. And certainly in Germany, they did an estimate of 1 in 75,000 for adults under 50 getting this complication. So if we come to children, we would be in a situation where the risk from the vaccine would be higher than their risk of COVID. And in fact, Professor Whitty himself said that in a quite recent press conference, that there's an age balance point where the risks of the disease are so low that the risks of side effects become greater than the risks of disease. So that was my feeling for why we really, really shouldn't be giving this to children, regardless of any hypothetical long-term effects, which we don't know about. We don't even feel it's sufficiently safe on short-term side effects. Alan, do you want to talk a bit about herd immunity? Because that's the other strong reason why we're told that children should be getting this, because of upward pressure on transmission to adults.
There's a very simple mathematical formula that links the R value and herd immunity. But the sort of levels of herd immunity that apply to COVID-19, they range from about 60% to about 80%. And it depends upon a lot of things, where in the country you live, because the temperature varies from the south to the north, and the season, etc., etc. But my estimation is that we hit herd immunity quite a while ago. We have, yesterday I think it was, 71% of the adult population have now been immunized with one dose. So, and then of course on top of that we have some cross immunity from common cold coronaviruses. And then we have naturally acquired immunity, those who have actually come across COVID and become infected and are therefore immune. So if you add these three together, I've no doubt that we hit herd immunity quite a while ago. So I don't think there's any justification for vaccinating children, even young people, because of herd immunity. But if I could look at this from a public health perspective, and as you know, public health looks at the population, the whole population, rather than individual patients. And in public health, as we develop vaccine programs, and we tend to manage the national vaccine programs, which are delivering mass interventions to healthy people as opposed to people who have symptoms and have disease. And when we're considering these sorts of programs, we need two things really. One is very firm evidence, clear trial evidence, ideally randomized controlled trials, and not just one, but we need that evidence to be replicated, showing that what the scale of benefits are, and also what the side effects are, and being able to quantify those side effects. The second thing we need is that we need to ensure that benefits far exceed harms, because these are healthy people that we're treating. And on both of these counts, the vaccination of children falls because we don't have firm evidence. There've been no trial results reported on children. There are one or two smaller trials going on at the moment, but there's a very poor body of evidence on children. Even in adults, we don't have good data on long-term side effects, and therefore we don't know about the level of side effects, and children are at very low risk from severe outcomes with COVID. So we don't have firm evidence, and therefore it is not a good idea to roll out vaccination in children, in my view.
And also, you mentioned the trials. The Astrazeneca Oxford Children's trial was suspended when there were side effects in young adults. So here was a drug which was thought to be going to be safe, and the side effects that cropped up in the young adults were not shown in the trials of the adults, because with only 11,000 in the treatment arm, that will pick up risks of 1 in 1,000, but it won't pick up risks of 1 in 50,000, clearly. So we didn't know when those children's trials were being started that there was already actually a risk to young adults. So then the children's trial had to be stopped. But Pfizer have already continued with their children's trial in the States, and they've now applied and received authorization, well, again, temporary, it's a temporary emergency license effectively, for rolling out down to 12 to 17-year-olds. And I've had a look at those trials, and there were only 1,100 children received the vaccine and 1,100 controls. And they had a lot of side effects. Their short-term side effects were far worse than you would expect from COVID in terms of, percentage having fever, fatigue, headaches, really being quite systemically unwell. which they aren't with COVID usually. So that's a worry. You know, those aren't serious. But there was a child with a deep vein thrombosis. Now, in all my career as a paediatrician, I haven't seen a child with a deep vein thrombosis. It just seemed very odd. So I think we need to keep a really open mind on this. I do not think we have evidence that these vaccines are safe for children. Full stop would be my view.
Perhaps I should say from the start of my experience from the pharmaceutical industry, which I spent all my life working in the R&D. In all my experience, the prospect of the pharmaceutical industry administering drugs to healthy people has always been a huge, I would say, worry. You know, the vaccines themselves over many years have proved the attenuated type and the dead vaccines and getting some antigenic determinants on these proteins have occasionally given rise to what we call idiosyncratic reactions. And that's always been a problem for the industry coping with these unexpected and unusual types of reactions that will appear. Over and above the vaccines issues of administering it to healthy people, the industry has always shown extreme caution when it comes to marketing drugs, and particularly to the young and to the old. We had a maxim in my company, which basically was talking about EOL, extremes of life, the young and the old. If you can possibly not touch them, you don't. You know, basically, the pharmaceutical industry is in the business of treating sickness, and so really, it's with extreme caution. We conducted trials in children. It's very difficult to do that in any preclinical studies, and very difficult to do any safety studies in the elderly. So you have to proceed extremely cautiously. Now, with respect to this disease, of course, it is particularly affecting the elderly, and really very, very, very interestingly, not touching or very little the young. And why that is, whether it's their T cells, whether it's being transferred from the mother to the baby, but for whatever reason, the babies and youngsters are very little affected, and as they get older, they're obviously getting more vulnerable. So that's something which is extremely interesting to me. Now, with respect to the vaccines, yes, I have, over this last few weeks and months, been proud to be operating as a volunteer down at our local vaccination centre. I suspect these vaccines, these particular vaccines, have been in the research phase for quite a long time. So they were able to get into the development phase very, very quickly. It is the development phase, of course, which traditionally in pharmaceuticals takes so long. And I'm not talking about months, I'm talking about years, and in some cases, decades of actually going through a variety of processes to get drugs onto the market. So it was, to me, astonishing that they were able to do this so quickly. That's not to say they cut corners, but I think it's been because they've had so long in their research phase. And of course, these are novel vaccines. This is a new approach to vaccination. It's never been done before, I think, Ros. And I think for that particular reason, we had to be and have to be extremely cautious. So I've been very proud to be able to help out at the vaccination center and get this rolled out to the very vulnerable people just as quickly as possible. But as far as I'm concerned now, it's been done. And the rest of the population, it's debatable whether or not you weighing up the various adverse events that have already been reported. I think it's debatable how far down the age range one should go. But we're not talking about the 60s, the 50s, the 40s. We're talking about children, the under 18s. And I see absolutely no justification at this stage, bearing in mind what you've said, Ros, about the vulnerability of the children, and bearing in mind what Alan has said about the public health and the herd immunity situation. I see absolutely no justification of having children vaccinated, bearing in mind that they are not affected by the disease, and bearing in mind we are talking about a brand new technology which needs to be cautiously progressed through these phase 3 clinical trials. We are still talking about an experimental phase of the drug development program. Phase 3 trials have often led to actually drugs not being marketed and having to be withdrawn. So we're not talking here about some perfectly safe, the sorts of words that have been used to launch these vaccines by government ministers and the like. We're not talking about perfectly safe drugs. Nothing can be perfectly safe. So we have to be extremely cautious. And I find it extraordinary, bearing in mind how very, very early we are in terms of developing these vaccines and their novelty, that they should be taking such a, what I describe as a heroic approach in terms of the vaccine program. But we've protected the vulnerable now, and please just let the children get on and live their lives.
Yes, I think that's an interesting point, John, because Kate Bingham, who was the chair of the task force, or the leader of the task force set to roll out this vaccine program, back in October, when of course the vaccines hadn't quite reached approval, she said very clearly that this is a program for the older members of the society and vulnerable, over 50s, and anybody with health vulnerabilities, and absolutely not for children. I think there's a glimmer of hope, though, that sanity might be returning, because I was very interested that over the last few weeks, the person I've been most worried that Professor Adam Finn, who I've been in correspondence with, and he's a professor in Bristol, and he's on the Joint Committee of Vaccination and Immunisation, and he's one of the lead researchers for AstraZeneca in the Bristol arm of the Oxford trial. And he's been on public television many times saying how important it is that we roll this out to children as quickly as possible, because even if they don't need it for their own protection, it'll be vital to reduce the constant upward pressure on transmission from children to adults. But yesterday on the Today programme, he was saying quite clearly that actually it wasn't needed for children, and he thought it was quite likely it wouldn't be needed at all for children. So he's slightly changed his position, which I was pleased to hear. We're waiting to hear back from the MHRA, but I know they've received our letter. I had a very interesting response from the department from Professor Whitty saying, oh, SAGE have no input on this at all, which was quite surprising. But to come back to the question of safety, I think a lot of people say, oh, but you know, it's safe. And I had somebody yesterday quoting at me that the phase 3 trials, they've done all the bits that matter, and the rest of it is following us up. But of course, that's not quite right. One of the troubles is that most of the people who were in the control arm of the trials, in the phase 3 trials, have now been offered vaccination. So actually, the ability to look at the two arms of the randomized trial have really disappeared. So what we're dependent on is post-marketing surveillance, and that should be good. But the yellow card system here is haphazard. You either put it on or you don't. If you don't think of it being a problem, you don't register it. And I have colleagues who've registered, you know, an older person with a stroke and had their contemporaries saying, oh, I don't understand why you're doing that, because you don't know that the vaccine was the cause of the stroke. And he's saying, no, of course I don't know. The whole point is all new drugs, they have a sort of black triangle in the formulary, which is like the Bible for prescribing. And for 2 years after a drug is first launched, you're meant to report any symptoms in people who've had that drug, so that the regulators, because the same people who regulate these drugs, receive all these yellow card data, and they will then be looking and thinking, well, is this cropping up more than we would expect in this vaccinated group? So it may be something that happens anyway, but you won't know whether it happens more in the vaccinated group unless everybody's reporting them. And they clearly are not. So that's one worry. And the other is that if you look in the American system, you can look at that. You can look at individual cases and everything, and they have already had some deaths of children. Now, they have only licensed it last week or 2 weeks ago, I think. I'm presuming one of the deaths must have been a child in a trial, but they haven't said that. But if you look, there are 8 deaths in under 18-year-olds. And certainly in the UK, we haven't had deaths of healthy children from COVID. So I think we really need to be extremely cautious here. And from an ethical point of view, I think that's the other thing that's changed. Societies, biologically, you protect the young, don't you? And somewhere through the whole pandemic, we've expected children to protect their elders. We've had phrases like "don't kill your granny," which I just thought was, at an emotional level, an awful message to be putting out. So we've had children out of school. We know we've messed up with their education and their mental health from the way we've expected children to be treated as if they were contagious at every step of the way. And I've seen educational materials circulating in London schools, both for secondary and for top primary, which are not honest. They're equating COVID vaccine to vaccines for, there are pictures of polio, smallpox, and tetanus. And they had a picture of a child in a tetanic spasm, and a picture of a child covered in smallpox, and a picture of a child in calipers from polio, and then saying to children, so do you want your vaccine? Hands up. It just really beggars belief. Completely saying these are safe, and nowhere mentioning what you've just said, John, which I think is important, that it is a totally novel technology. These are not standard vaccines that have been used for decades for other diseases and have simply been adapted for a new disease. They are a new technology. They may be safe, but we don't know the long-term safety.
Well, just on that point, actually, in one of my incarnations, I was R&D director of a biotechnology firm in Australia, and we were developing a rotavirus vaccine. Well, you will know about rotavirus. And this was what I describe as conventional vaccine. And we were obviously having to test them in children because that's where the disease is. It's not rotavirus is not a disease of the elderly, or it's a disease of young children who die in their thousands. Now, we did a phase 2 trial, and unfortunately, we didn't think at that time that we had a sufficient immunological response, bearing in mind that we are talking about treating children. And we wanted to make sure that the benefit, such as we could glean from just immunological data, was going to be good enough. It wasn't, so we dropped it. Now, with respect to the novelty of this vaccine, we are talking about a vaccine that is completely novel with respect to its mechanism of action. We are introducing a gene which is promoting the production of a protein, which is being described generally as the spike protein, and we have no idea really how much spike protein is being produced. And that's going to depend, because we're all biologically different, we're going to find ourselves with different amounts of spike protein being produced. And we don't know how long for, how much, and I'm not sure how much toxicology, safety evaluation, preclinical work, if you like, has been done on this spike protein. We certainly do know it not only stimulates antibodies from the appropriate cells, but it interacts with other mammalian systems. It's known. As a pharmacologist, I would expect to see the benefits from what I call the good pharmacology, but extended pharmacology in terms of high doses will lead into what is actually, to me, predictable, the thrombocytopenia. These aren't rare and unusual. It is affecting a system that we can predict from the pharmacology it will affect. If I can use an analogy of aspirin, for instance, we know that aspirin has beneficial effects with respect to pain. But we also know that if you take enough of it, it causes bleeding in the stomach. Same mechanism of action. It's just too much aspirin. And we don't know. And this, I believe this is the same sort of thing that's happening with respect to the spike protein. In some individuals, it's not going to have any effect or small effect. In others, it might have much more dramatic effects. So really, I think here we are talking about a completely novel approach to vaccination, where we are getting a secondary effect from the vaccine. The vaccine itself is producing a spike protein, which is producing the antibodies, but also potentially having effects on other mammalian systems. Yes. We need to explore this with extreme care, especially in the long term.
I had a friend of mine who said it was quite an interesting question that they asked when they were being offered the vaccine was, could somebody tell them what the dosage of spike protein was? And of course, nobody could. So if you're given a hepatitis vaccine, for example, it'll say on the bottle, 10 micrograms of hepatitis antigen per mil or whatever, or per dose. And that's what you're given. But this, you're given the tools with which to make your own spike protein. And so obviously the amount of spike protein, as you've rightly said, will be very variable. And maybe that explains partly why the more severe side effects do seem to be worse in younger groups because perhaps they're more efficient at making more spike protein. You mentioned thrombocytopenia, and only yesterday I saw a statement from the European Medicines Agency, which are now listing thrombocytopenia, that's low platelet count, as a common side effect. So that means between 1 in 10 and 1 in 100. So this is not rare.
There have been reports in Israel of young men particularly getting myocarditis. So that is quite worrying. That's inflammation of the heart, of course. So all of these side effects make me think again of this benefit-harm ratio. If you have uncertainty about the side effects, and we do have uncertainty about the long-term side effects, and also given that a lot of the people in the control arms of these trials are now getting the vaccination, so we don't have a comparison group to compare to, we have to be very cautious. And as you come down the age bands, the decision becomes a bit more difficult. It's a bit finer judgment. And I would put that sort of threshold at 50 or 60, where the JCVI initially, they identified the 9 priority risk groups for vaccination, and they stopped at 50 and only below 50 if they had serious underlying conditions. But I'm certainly very anxious about the vaccination of young people, and even more so with children, when the risks from COVID are so much less. So the benefit side of the equation is so much smaller, and the side effects, we know about some, we don't know about long-term side effects. So you must be cautious.
You're quite right, Alan. It's what we don't know. It's all very well to say that we've done the testing, etc. But at this particular stage, bearing their novelty that we've talked about, bearing that they're working in a completely different way than conventional vaccines, it's far too early to start talking about complete safety, even for adults. But for children, no. I mentioned something, Ros, that you talked about, the yellow card system. It was introduced during my time in the industry for very good reasons. There had been all sorts of hiccups with respect to anti-inflammatories and various other classes of drugs, which necessitated this very, very careful monitoring post-marketing. Well, it's only anecdotal, but my own experiences of having the vaccines, both the first and the second dose, the Pfizer doses, and my wife who had the Astrazeneca, I wasn't given any information with respect to how to make an adverse reaction report. It's as if the vaccines have just been given, just as I was being given the flu vaccine. And I'm not saying necessarily that the yellow card system is not fit for purpose, but I do think that the rollout of this vaccine and the way it has been done, which has been rapid, but I don't think really there has been sufficient regard with respect to those people administering the dose, making sure that the drug that they've been given, if I can call it a drug, is just seen just as another drug, not as a new and innovative medicine. And they should have been told, in my view, that this is something that they should monitor very, very carefully and report any particular side effects. That's the whole point of the yellow card system. And I think there has been really some negligence. I would go as far as saying that in not really making sure the population, the mass vaccination program has not really addressed this properly.
I think you're absolutely right, John. I think that it would have been quite simple to have given everybody at the time of their vaccination a little leaflet with the details of the MHRA yellow card system, and say, please report back after 30 days and let us know how you've got on. Really, so everybody would be filling a report. And you buy something on Amazon and it arrives on your doorstep, and within 24 hours you're being asked to rate it. But
that's
nobody
right.
Being asked to rate these. And I think if there'd been a proper systematic way of checking on adverse effects, we would have become aware of these thrombotic complications much sooner. The problems with AstraZeneca, I think when they were highlighted, and a lot of countries have withdrawn AstraZeneca for under 50s, but the assumption has simply been, oh, well, let's swap to Pfizer. And because we've got less experience with Pfizer, we will obviously have seen less side effects. But if you look on the American system, where they've largely been using Pfizer and very little AstraZeneca, they may be slightly less in number. It might be 2/3 the number of the AZ complications, but they're the same sort of complications. You can read them: strokes, thrombotic events, etc. So I think we're rash if we just then roll out an alternative vaccine to these groups of people who, as you say, are themselves not at risk from COVID. So I think we come back to this thing of first, absolutely first, do no harm. At the moment, there are far too many unknowns. We need to wait until at least 2 years down the road, in my view, till all the proper long-term follow-up is available, and by which time a lot of pandemics burn themselves out over 2 or 3 years anyway. So by 2 years from now, we may be seeing that it's unnecessary anyway, and we'll at least then know whether it's safe. But we know it's not necessary for children themselves. And to ask children themselves to do something for herd immunity, you know, I as a grandparent would say, absolutely, don't do this for my sake, please. And I think there we should stop.
Yeah,
Thank
well
you
done,
guys
Ros.
very much for
Thank
joining
you.
me. Bye.
Thank you very much.